The range of hobby supplies available to us is ever growing, whether that's new tools, fancy paintbrushes, or in particular new ranges of miniature paints. Some of these new paints come with some degree of hype surrounding them, often boasting that they give better coverage, a matte finish, or are just generally superior to existing brands out there. But should we really be following the hype? And to the average hobbyist such as myself, does any of this really matter? In this video, I intend to find out for myself whether one of these new brands on the block live up to the hype, or whether the established brands I already own are just as good. I'm Benji, and welcome to Benji's Hobbies. When I got back into the hobby 5 or so years ago, I started by picking up Citadel paints from my local Warhammer store, and to this day the majority of the paints I use are Citadel. Last year I also bought the Army Painter Mega Paint Set to give me another brand to try out, so essentially I own 2 solid ranges of paints from 2 of the most mainstream miniature paint manufacturers. Like many other hobbyists out there, I tend to lurk in various Facebook groups, and in certain groups I notice that there's, well, an element of elitism, shall we say, when it comes to painting miniatures. Certain more niche or less readily available brands are pushed and recommended, and there is almost this feeling of marginalisation if you paint only using the more commonly available brands. Is this because some people want to feel superior when painting their toy soldiers? Is it because they want to keep people out of their elite painting club? Or do these unfamiliar paint brands really make a difference when it comes to painting? And should you, as a hobbyist like me, look at replacing your existing paints? Today I'm going to run a little test using 3 brands of paint: my old faithful Citadel, Army Painter, and the new kids on the block Monument Hobbies Pro Acryl range, which I brought from my local gaming store with the help of my kind supporters over on Patreon. If you want to support the channel like those lovely folk, then do please go and check out the link down in the description below. I'm going to paint up 3 Space Marines in similar colours, but each one will be painted only using paints from one of the 3 brands. I'll be using a range of different colours, both metallic and non-metallic, and where available I'll also be using washes from each brand as well. We'll be looking at the different properties of the paints, and I'll be giving you my opinions on which ones performed well and which ones maybe to avoid. I'd like to caveat at this point that I'm not the world's best painter, and whilst I generally paint to a slightly better than tabletop standard, I'm certainly not winning any awards for my work, so my opinion on these paints will be from this level of expertise. If you're expecting creamy blends and crisp edge highlighting, then you're watching the wrong channel, I'm afraid. But stick around anyway, you can always go and watch some Miniac videos after this one. Before I start painting, let's take a closer look at the brands that I'm going to be putting through their paces. First up, we've got Citadel by Games Workshop. These are the only paints that we're looking at today that come in the much maligned flip top pots that so many of you out there seem to hate. With a volume of only 12ml and retailing from £2.34 from my local gaming store, these are the most expensive paints we'll be looking at today, at just under 20p per milliliter for the standard paints in the range. Next, we'll be painting with Army Painter. These come in a handy dropper bottle that contains 18ml of paint. These are by far the cheapest I'll be looking at only £2.03 per bottle, or just over 11p per milliliter. Almost half the price of the Citadel paints. These are definitely at the cheaper end of the paint brand spectrum. And last but not least, we'll be using the Pro Acryl range from Monument Hobbies. These huge dropper bottles contain a hefty 22ml of paint. That's 45% more than the Citadel pots. At £3.60 per bottle, this works out at just over 16p per milliliter, which is halfway between Games Workshop and Army Painter prices. One really nice feature about these paints is they are supplied with a mixing bead or ball bearing already in the bottle, which for me already gives them a little edge over the competition. One last thing to note before I start painting, I won't be making any changes to these paints, and other than thinning them down a little with water on my wet palette, I won't be adding any other mediums or thinners which may affect the paint's properties. I will, however, be adding some glass beads to the Army Painter bottles, and will be using a vortex mixer, as well as giving each one a good shake by hand to help me thoroughly mix each paint before I use them. The miniatures I'm going to be painting today are some standard Space Marine intercessors that I've primed in grey, courtesy of the Colourforge, who recently sent me a sample pack of spray, primers and varnish. I'm loving the finish it's given, and their standard grey primer colour matches really well with Mechanica's standard grey. With a huge range of colours available, I think these may well become my spray can staple, and if you want to try them for yourselves, I've popped a link down in the description below for you to check out for yourselves. So with all the boring stuff out of the way, let's get painting these Marines. I'm starting off by base coating the models entirely in red, specifically Corn Red from Games Workshop, Dragon Red from Army Painter and Burnt Red from Pro Acryl. Games Workshop and Pro Acryl both performed phenomenally, giving me excellent coverage, which is just what I want for a base coat. The Army Painter though unfortunately left a lot to be desired, and the first coat behaved more like a wash than a paint, flowing into all the recesses, and it took several coats to get a somewhat even finish. It also had a really gloopy texture, which compared to the other paints I didn't particularly like. Not a great start from Army Painter. With the main colour down, it's time to block in the various other colours. I started with gold on the chestplate Aquillas, black on the shoulder pads and bolter casings, a silver trim to the shoulder pads and on the metallic areas of the bolters, brown for the belt and holster, and grey for the weird pipey under armour stuff bits that Space Marines wear. I don't know what to call them. From the non-metallic colours, I was really impressed by both the Army Painter and Pro Acryl black paints. Both went down really smoothly, gave an excellent coverage, and left me with a super matte finish which I really like. They thinned down nicely without being too opaque, and when applied to the models the coverage was really nice and smooth. With the Army Painter though, I had some similar problems as I had with the first red layer. Whilst they weren't as runny, they were still really opaque, and in some cases needed a few coats to give a decent finish. And I really didn't like the gloopy texture that they had when they were on the palette, even when they were mixed with a little bit of water. Moving on to the metallics, all the brands performed incredibly well. I've always had a soft spot for Lead Belcher and Retributor armour, but Army Painter and Pro Acryl certainly gave them a run for their money. They are however a little bit thinner than the Games Workshop paints, which to me is a good thing, as I feel like I'll be able to paint gold or silver areas without risking losing any of the detail from a thicker paint. They do tend to separate pretty quickly on the wet palette though, so it's worth only adding what you know you're going to be using there and then. With regards to washes, there's not an awful lot to say, besides both that Games Workshop shade paints and Army Painter washes both performed really well. Personally, I like using washes straight out of the pots rather than off my palette, so for me the Games Workshop shades just edge a win, but I know this will definitely be down to personal preference. Pro Acryl don't currently make any washes, so it'll be interesting to see if this is something they work on in the future. So how about mixing? Do these brands mix well for creating different colours, shades and tones? For each brand I'm adding some of the original red and a little ivory to the wet palette and using a large brush to mix them together. The plan being to use the resulting colours as my highlight for the Space Marine armour. Whilst all of the paints mix, the Games Workshop and Pro Acryl paints definitely mix better than my Army Painter paints. I don't know for certain, but it certainly feels like this weird texture on the Dragon Red prevents them from mixing together thoroughly. It was still usable as a highlight colour, but it just didn't feel like it applied as smoothly as the other two brands did. Because I'm a glutton for punishment, I decided at the last minute to paint one knee pad on each Marine in white. White is a colour that I personally avoid painting wherever possible, but as this is a test, it made sense to try and put them through their paces. Pro Acryl Titanium White absolutely knocked this one out of the park, and gave me a lovely smooth finish in minimal coats. I did eventually get a nice smooth finish with both Games Workshop and Army Painter, but it felt like it took me a lot more work to get there. I painted in some other bits of detail like the purity seals and eyes, added a desert themed base and some grass tufts, and with that, they're done. So what's the verdict on each brand? Am I going to be binning off my Citadel and Army Painter paints and buying the full Pro Acryl range? Well, not just yet. Overall, the Pro Acryl paints were great and were a lot better than I was expecting them to be. It felt like there was some great consistency from paint to paint in terms of how it went onto the models, and the super matte finish is something I really liked about them. The black and white paints in particular were standouts for me purely because of the finish and the amazing coverage they gave on these models. I also really loved the large nozzles on the bottles, as it feels that they're unlikely to get clogged, which is something I can't say for the Army Painter bottles. The mixing beads included is a really nice touch, and being reasonably priced for the volume you get is definitely a bonus. My only downside is I don't currently have a rack that is big enough for them, but I'm sure that's something I can fix in the future. Games Workshop performed just as well as I had expected, being my faithful paints of choice. I know I got a lot of hate in one of my previous videos when I said I quite like the pots, and my opinion on that hasn't really changed on them. One of the other things that I really love about the Games Workshop range is the base coat, shade and layer system, which makes getting consistent colours for army painting easy compared to having to mix your own colours. They also definitely gave me comparable coverage to the Pro Acryl paints, but the low volume and high comparable price has definitely made me question my next painting purchases. Army Painter really disappointed me. From the first base coat, I found them to be really hard work and didn't give me the finish I expected, and just weren't fun to paint with. And before anybody shouts at me in the comments, I really did give them a lot of thorough shaking before I used them, and it didn't help at all with the consistency. I know Luke from Geek Gaming did a video a long time ago on making Army Painter paints more usable by adding thinners and mediums, but as a consumer, I don't feel like I should have to do the extra work with my paints to get them to behave how I want them to. I just want them to work straight out of the pot like the other two brands did. Even though they're the cheapest brands I tested, I'd absolutely prefer to spend just a little bit more and get a product that just works better out of the pot. Final verdict, if I were buying all of my paint range again, I'd more than likely go with Pro Acryl. They really are great, and I think given the price, volume of the pots and the excellent consistency across the range, they're a winner and a range that I'm looking forward to using more in the future. If you want to pick some of these paints up for yourselves, I've popped a link down in the description below. And if you're already using them, I'd love to know what your experiences are with them as well. So let me know down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I hope to see you in the next video.